I'm Nicoletta Weber, 26, and I built my life from the ground up, working since I was 16 to keep my family's lights on. For years, I gave up my own education and dreams so my sister could thrive. But at a Christmas gathering, I overheard my dad call me a deadbeat, and that moment changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or undervalued by the very people you sacrificed for? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being written off, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-worth. Because what happened next, even I didn't see coming. Growing up in the Weber household meant understanding that image mattered more than truth. My mother polished the silver every Sunday, whether we had guests or not. My father straightened his tie before answering the door, even for the mailman. Everything had to look perfect from the outside, and somehow I became the family's invisible foundation, the one who made that perfection possible without ever getting credit for it. I was 16 when I started working weekends at Miller's Hardware, not because I wanted spending money, but because Dad's hours had been cut at the plant. Mom never said anything directly, but I'd catch her staring at the bills spread across the kitchen table, her fingers drumming against the wood in that worried rhythm. My paychecks went straight into the household fund, no questions asked. Helen, my older sister by 3 years, was busy with cheerleading and college applications. Nobody expected her to sacrifice her weekends. The pattern started early. When Helen needed money for prom, I picked up extra shifts. When Dad's car broke down, I postponed getting my driver's license and contributed to the repair fund instead. When Mom's arthritis flared up, I took over the grocery shopping and cooking dinner most nights. I told myself it was temporary, that things would balance out eventually. Helen graduated valedictorian and went off to State University on a partial scholarship. The remaining tuition came from my college fund, the one I'd been building since I was 14 with birthday money and weekend wages. Just for the first semester, Dad promised. We'll figure something else out after that. We never did. Helen's education became the family priority, and mine became the sacrifice we didn't talk about. During Helen's junior year, she met Marcus at a campus military recruitment event. He was 25, already a decorated sergeant in the Army National Guard, with plans to make the military his career. When she brought him home for Thanksgiving, I watched Dad's entire demeanor change. Suddenly there was a man at our table who commanded automatic respect, whose achievements were visible and understood. Dad hung on every word about Marcus's tours, his commendations, his leadership roles. Now that's what I call a real future, Dad said after Marcus left that night. Helen picked herself a winner. I was working full-time at the hardware store by then, having given up on college entirely. My boss, Mr. Miller, had offered to help me apply for business school, said I had a head for numbers and people respected me. But every time I saved enough for application fees, something came up. Helen's books, Dad's medication copays, Mom's physical therapy. I kept telling myself next semester, next year. Marcus and Helen married the summer after her graduation, in a ceremony that depleted what remained of my parents' savings. I paid for the flowers and the reception hall without being asked. At the wedding, Marcus sought me out during the reception. Helen tells me you've been holding this family together for years, he said, his voice carrying that military directness I'd grown to appreciate. That means something. I shrugged it off, uncomfortable with the recognition. Family takes care of family. Not everyone sees it that way, he replied, glancing toward where Dad was holding court with some relatives, telling them about his son-in-law, the war hero. After the wedding, Marcus and Helen moved to his base in Colorado. They came back twice a year, Christmas and summer leave. During those visits, Dad transformed into a different person. He asked Marcus about strategy, about leadership, about world affairs. He bragged to neighbors about his military son-in-law, showing off the photos Helen sent of Marcus in dress uniform. Meanwhile, I'd been promoted to assistant manager at Miller's. I'd taken over most of the bookkeeping, learned to handle difficult customers, and had even helped expand the store's online presence. But when relatives asked Dad about his daughters, he'd talk about Helen's teaching career and Marcus's military service. About me, he'd say, "Well, she's still at the hardware store," in a tone that suggested temporary employment rather than a career path. The dismissive comments started small. Family jokes about my simple job. Casual mentions of how Helen had really made something of herself. Subtle implications that my contributions to the household were expected rather than appreciated. When I bought my first car, used, but mine, Dad commented that it was nice to see you finally becoming independent, as if I hadn't been financially supporting the family for 8 years. Helen noticed the pattern during one Christmas visit. "Dad doesn't mean anything by it," she said when I mentioned feeling invisible. "You know how he is about appearances." "It's not about appearances anymore," I told her. "He genuinely doesn't see what I do here." "You're being too sensitive," she replied, but I caught her watching Dad more carefully after that conversation. The real shift happened the following summer. Marcus had been promoted to staff sergeant, and Dad couldn't stop talking about it. During dinner, he launched into a detailed explanation of military ranks to anyone who would listen, as if he'd studied them personally. When the conversation turned to local business news, Miller's had been featured in the county paper for our community service projects. Dad barely acknowledged it. "That's nice, honey," he said, already turning back to Marcus to ask about base operations. That night, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. "She's 25 years old," Mom was saying. "Still working at that same job, no real plans." "Well, not everyone can be Helen," Dad replied. "Some people are just different." The word hung in the air like smoke. Different. Not ambitious. Not successful. Just different, as if my years of sacrifice had been personal choice rather than family necessity. I lay awake that night, staring at my ceiling, calculating. 8 years of weekends. Thousands of dollars in paychecks handed over without complaint. College applications never sent. Business school dreams deferred indefinitely. All of it dismissed as different, as if I'd chosen this path for my own convenience rather than theirs. For the first time, I started to wonder what would happen if I stopped being the family foundation. If I stopped absorbing the cost of everyone else's dreams and started pursuing my own. The thought felt dangerous and liberating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you could actually jump. The comments became sharper over the following months, more pointed. Dad stopped asking about my day at work entirely. When neighbors inquired about me, he changed the subject to Helen's latest teaching award or Marcus's leadership training. I started to feel like a ghost in my own family, present but not really seen. During phone calls with Helen, Dad would spend 20 minutes discussing Marcus's career trajectory and 2 minutes asking if I was still doing the same thing. When I mentioned Mr. Miller's offer to help finance my business degree, Dad laughed. "At your age? Seems a little late for that, don't you think?" I was 26. Helen had been younger when she started college. The breaking point built slowly, like pressure behind a dam. Small slights accumulated into larger resentments. Family stories got retold with me edited out. Helen's wedding became affordable through careful planning rather than my flower money. The house improvements happened because Dad was handy rather than because I'd paid for materials. My role in keeping the family financially stable during the lean years became footnotes or disappeared entirely. Christmas arrived with Marcus home on extended leave. He'd been deployed for 6 months, and Dad treated his return like a homecoming parade. The dinner table conversation revolved entirely around military life, international politics, and Helen's classroom stories. When I mentioned that Miller's was considering franchising, potentially offering me a partnership opportunity, Dad nodded absently before asking Marcus about weapons training. After dinner, I was loading the dishwasher when I heard Dad in the living room, talking to his brother. Helen really hit the jackpot with Marcus. Career military, steady income, real leadership potential. What about your other daughter? Uncle Jim asked. Dad's voice dropped, but not enough. She's nothing but a deadbeat. The plate I was holding slipped from my hands and shattered against the floor. The sound echoed through the kitchen, but not as loudly as those 5 words echoed in my head. Nothing but a deadbeat. From my father's mouth, describing his daughter who'd spent 8 years keeping his household afloat. I stood there among the broken ceramic pieces, my cheeks burning with shame and rage. 8 years of sacrifice, of putting his family's needs before my own ambitions, and this was his assessment of my worth. Not struggling, not figuring things out, not even disappointingly dependent. A deadbeat. Someone who contributed nothing, took everything, deserved nothing. My hands shook as I swept up the pieces. Through the doorway, I could see Dad continuing his conversation, completely unaware that I'd heard him. Uncle Jim laughed at something, and Dad joined in, both of them comfortable in their casual dismissal of my existence. I finished cleaning the kitchen in mechanical silence, my mind racing. Every family gathering where I'd bitten my tongue. Every time I'd let his casual cruelty slide to keep the peace. Every moment I'd convinced myself he didn't mean it, that he was just thoughtless, not actively cruel. All of it collapsed under the weight of that single word. Deadbeat. When I walked back into the living room, Dad smiled at me like nothing had happened. All cleaned up? You're so good at taking care of things. I stared at him, this man who could praise my domestic usefulness while calling me worthless in the same breath. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I was valuable enough to handle his household maintenance, but not valuable enough to merit basic respect. Helen and Marcus were on the couch, going through photo albums from his deployment. Marcus looked up and smiled. Your sister's been showing me pictures from when you two were kids. You always looked like you were taking care of everyone else. Someone had to, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Dad laughed from his chair. Well, that's what family's for, right? Everyone pitches in. The casual rewriting of history was breathtaking. Everyone pitches in, as if the financial contribution had been equally distributed. As if Helen's college fund hadn't come from my wages. As if the choice to sacrifice my education for theirs had been a mutual family decision rather than something that fell to me by default. Marcus was watching me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Military training, probably, the ability to read tension, to sense when situations were more complex than they appeared on the surface. What kind of business degree are you looking at? He asked. Dad interrupted before I could answer. Oh, she's not serious about that. Too expensive at this point, and, honestly, she's comfortable where she is. Comfortable. As if my current situation was my preference rather than the result of years of family financial planning that never included my future as a priority. As if I'd chosen this path rather than had it chosen for me by circumstances and expectations. Actually, I said, my voice gaining strength, Mr. Miller thinks I have real potential. The partnership opportunity could lead to owning my own business eventually. Dad waved his hand dismissively. Well, we'll see. Big dreams don't always work out. The irony was suffocating. Helen's big dreams had worked out, funded by my small paychecks. Marcus's big dreams were working out, supported by family pride and celebration. But my dreams were risky, unrealistic, too expensive, too late. Marcus was still watching me, and I saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or understanding. He'd probably seen this dynamic in other families, the designated sacrifice, the one whose contributions get taken for granted while everyone else's achievements get celebrated. Running a business takes real leadership skills, Marcus said quietly. Not everyone can handle that kind of responsibility. Dad nodded enthusiastically. Exactly right. It's a big step up from retail. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Retail, as if 8 years of learning operations, customer service, inventory management, and financial planning were just playing store. As if the skills I developed weren't transferable or valuable. As if my work was somehow less real than what he considered legitimate careers. I excused myself early that night, claiming exhaustion. But I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening over and over. The casual cruelty of Deadbeat mixed with the patronizing dismissal of my ambitions. The way he could simultaneously expect my continued support while openly disrespecting my worth. For the first time in years, I started planning for myself instead of for the family. I had savings now, money I'd been setting aside for the next family emergency that always seemed to come. Maybe it was time to spend it on my own emergency. The emergency of a life half-lived, dreams deferred, and self-respect eroded by years of unacknowledged sacrifice. New Year's Day arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes you question why anyone chooses to live in the Midwest. Helen and Marcus were extending their stay through the weekend, and Mom had planned another family dinner. The prospect of sitting through another evening of Dad's subtle digs while pretending everything was fine felt exhausting. I'd spent the week since Christmas in a strange emotional limbo. The word deadbeat had lodged itself in my brain like a splinter, painful every time I moved wrong. I found myself replaying conversations from years past, noticing patterns I'd previously dismissed. The way Dad's praise always came with conditions, his support always came with criticism, his recognition always came with qualifications. Mr. Miller had stopped by the store on December 30th with franchise paperwork and partnership contracts. "Don't let this opportunity pass you by," he'd said. "I've watched you grow into this job, and you're ready for the next level. But timing matters in business." The paperwork sat on my kitchen table like a challenge. Loan applications, business plans, projections for the next 5 years. A future I could choose instead of one that happened to me by default. But it required courage I wasn't sure I possessed, the courage to disappoint people who were already disappointed in me. Saturday evening came with Mom's pot roast and Dad's pontification about current events. Marcus listened politely, occasionally offering insights from his military perspective. Helen updated us on her students' progress. I mostly pushed food around my plate and tried to look engaged. "I've been thinking about Marcus's suggestion," Dad said, cutting into his meat with unnecessary precision. "About leadership skills and business ownership." My stomach clenched. Here it came, another gentle dismissal wrapped in fatherly concern. "And honestly, I think you should be realistic about your limitations," he continued, not looking at me directly. "Some people are natural leaders, and others are better at following directions. There's no shame in knowing which one you are." The words hit like a physical blow. Not just because of their casual cruelty, but because he'd twisted Marcus's supportive comment into ammunition for his own argument. He'd taken his son-in-law's encouragement and weaponized it against me. "Dad," Helen started, but he held up his hand. "I'm just saying, jumping into business ownership at her age, with her experience level, it seems risky. What happens when it fails? She'll be back to square one, except older and more in debt. When it fails. Not if. When." He'd already decided I was destined for failure, that my dreams were inherently unrealistic, that my 8 years of learning and growing meant nothing when weighed against his assessment of my capabilities. Marcus set down his fork with deliberate care. "What kind of experience do you think it takes to run a business?" Dad launched into a lecture about education, credentials, networking, capital investment. All the things I supposedly lacked. All the barriers he'd helped create by prioritizing Helen's education over mine, by expecting my financial contribution to the household instead of my financial independence from it. "She's been managing inventory, handling customer relations, doing bookkeeping, training new employees," Marcus said when Dad paused for breath. "Sounds like business experience to me." "Well, that's different," Dad said dismissively. "That's just retail work. Real business ownership requires strategic thinking, leadership ability, decision-making skills." The implication was clear. I possessed none of those qualities. In Dad's worldview, I was permanently relegated to following other people's instructions, implementing other people's visions, supporting other people's dreams. My 8 years at Miller's weren't career development, they were evidence of my limitations. Marcus was watching Dad with an expression I recognized from family photos, the look he wore during serious military briefings. Focused, analytical, slightly dangerous. Strategic thinking like managing cash flow during slow seasons? Decision-making like choosing which suppliers to work with? Leadership like training staff and handling difficult customers? "Those aren't the same thing," Dad insisted, but his voice carried less certainty now. "They're exactly the same thing," Marcus said quietly. "Just on a smaller scale initially." Dad's face flushed slightly. He wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by someone whose opinion he respected. The cognitive dissonance was visible. Marcus was supposed to agree with him, to validate his assessment, to join him in gentle discouragement disguised as protective concern. "Look," Dad said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining things to people he considered slow, "I know you want to be supportive, but as her father, I have to be practical. She's not Helen. She doesn't have the same drive, the same intelligence, the same potential. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Mom stopped eating, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. Helen stared at Dad like she'd never seen him before. But it was Marcus who broke the silence, his voice carrying a military authority I'd never heard directed at my father. With all due respect, sir, that's the biggest load of bullshit I've ever heard. Dad's mouth fell open. In 30 years of marriage and fatherhood, I'd never seen anyone speak to him that way. Mom gasped. Helen reached for Marcus's arm as if to restrain him, but he gently moved away from her touch. Your daughter has spent 8 years sacrificing her own goals to support this family, Marcus continued, his voice level but implacable. She paid for Helen's college, contributed to household expenses, postponed her own education, and never once complained about it. That's not lack of drive, that's extraordinary character. Dad tried to interrupt, but Marcus held up one hand, and something in his demeanor made Dad actually stop talking. She manages a retail operation, handles customer service, does financial planning, trains employees, and has built enough trust with her boss that he's offering her a partnership. That's not lack of intelligence, that's proven competence. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Direct, uncompromising, devastatingly accurate. Marcus wasn't defending me out of politeness or family obligation. He was stating facts that everyone at the table knew but had never acknowledged. And as for potential, Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Dad's face, I've watched her hold this family together for years while you took credit for the stability she provided. If that's not potential, I don't know what is. Dad's face had gone from flushed to pale. Now wait just a minute, no sir, Marcus interrupted, and his voice carried the kind of authority that ended arguments rather than started them. You wait a minute. I've been listening to you dismiss your daughter's accomplishments and abilities for 2 years now. I've watched her absorb your casual insults and keep functioning anyway. But calling her a deadbeat? That crosses a line. The room went completely still. Dad's eyes widened as he realized Marcus had heard the comment from the previous week. The casual cruelty he'd thought was private had been witnessed, recorded, and was now being thrown back at him by the one person in the family whose opinion he actually valued. I didn't, Dad started, but Marcus cut him off again. You did. And honestly, sir, it disgusts me. She's not a deadbeat, she's the reason this family hasn't fallen apart financially. And if you can't see that, if you can't appreciate what she's sacrificed for all of you, then you don't deserve her loyalty. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then excruciating. Dad sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before, shock, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been recognition. Mom looked like she'd been slapped. Helen stared at her husband with a mixture of pride and concern, probably wondering if he'd just destroyed family peace permanently. I felt like I was watching the scene from outside my own body. Someone had finally said the things I'd been thinking for years, but never had the courage to voice. Marcus had held up a mirror to Dad's behavior, and the reflection was ugly enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Marcus, Helen said softly, maybe we should know, he said, his voice gentler now but still firm. This needed to be said. I've been watching it happen for 2 years, and I should have spoken up sooner. Dad cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the conversation. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I never meant to imply. Yes, you did, Marcus interrupted. You meant exactly what you said. And you've been saying versions of it for years, just usually when you thought she couldn't hear you. The accuracy of that statement hit like a physical blow. How many conversations had Marcus witnessed that I'd missed? How many times had Dad dismissed me while Marcus listened, cataloging the pattern of casual disrespect? I'm proud of both my daughters, Dad said, his voice defensive now. I've always supporting Helen's dreams with your other daughter's money isn't the same thing as supporting both your daughters, Marcus said. And dismissing her goals while celebrating everyone else's achievements isn't pride, it's favoritism. Dad's mouth opened and closed without sound. The word favoritism hung in the air like an accusation none of us could ignore. It was the thing we'd all known but never named, the elephant that had been sitting at our family table for years. That's not. Dad tried again, but his protest sounded hollow even to him. It is, I said, speaking for the first time since Marcus had started his defense. My voice came out steady, stronger than I'd expected. It's exactly what it is. All eyes turned to me. I'd been silent for so long that my voice seemed to surprise everyone, including myself. But Marcus's words had given me permission to speak truths I'd been swallowing for years. Helen needed college money, so mine disappeared. Helen needed wedding expenses, so I paid for flowers and the reception hall. Helen needed support while she got established in her career, so I kept contributing to household expenses even after she moved out. But when I need something, education, business opportunities, even basic respect, suddenly the family can't afford it. Dad's face was flushing again. That's not how it happened. We all made sacrifices. No, I said, my voice gaining strength. I made sacrifices. You made decisions about how to spend my sacrifices. The distinction was crucial. Sacrifice implies choice, agency, a willing giving up of something valuable. What had happened to me was more like taxation, automatic, expected, unacknowledged, and non-negotiable. You paid for college, Helen said suddenly, her voice small. I never knew. I thought it was Dad's savings. It was my college fund, I told her, not unkindly. The one I'd been building since high school. Dad said it was just for one semester, that we'd figure something else out later. But we never did. Helen's face crumpled. Why didn't you ever say anything? Because family takes care of family, I quoted Dad's favorite phrase back at him. Because someone had to be practical. Because your education was more important than mine. I never said that, Dad protested. You didn't have to say it, I replied. You showed it. Every time you celebrated Helen's achievements while dismissing mine. Every time you found money for her needs, but not for my opportunities. Every time you introduced her as my daughter the teacher, and me as someone who works at the hardware store. Dad's protest died in his throat. The pattern was too obvious to deny now that it had been laid out in sequence. Years of casual dismissals, redirected conversations, and unequal treatment that had been normalized through repetition. I worked hard to get where I am, Helen said defensively. So did I replied. I just worked hard at different things. Things that benefited the family instead of just myself. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's what I've been trying to tell him. Different doesn't mean less valuable. Dad looked around the table like he was seeing us all clearly for the first time. His authority was gone, his comfortable narrative disrupted, his casual cruelties exposed under bright lights. For the first time in my adult life, he looked uncertain. I never meant to make you feel unappreciated, he said finally, the words sounding rehearsed and insufficient. But you did, I said simply. You made me feel like my contributions didn't count, like my dreams weren't worth supporting, like I was just a convenient resource to be used when needed and dismissed when not. That's not, he started, then stopped. Maybe he was finally hearing how his protests sounded. How defensive and hollow they were when measured against years of documented behavior. Mom spoke for the first time since Marcus's initial confrontation. Maybe we should all take a break from this conversation. It was her standard response to family conflict: deflect, defer, hope it would resolve itself through avoidance. But Marcus shook his head. Respectfully, ma'am, I don't think this should be tabled. This is about basic respect and fairness, and those aren't topics that improve with time. Dad was staring at his plate now, the fight gone out of him. Whether from shame, anger, or genuine recognition, I couldn't tell. But for the first time in years, he wasn't controlling the conversation or dismissing other people's perspectives. I think, I said carefully, I need some space to figure out what comes next. The words surprised everyone, including me. But they felt right, necessary, long overdue. Years of absorbing casual cruelty had to stop somewhere, and Marcus's defense had given me permission to draw that line. Space from what? Helen asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. From being taken for granted, I said. From having my contributions dismissed while they're being accepted. From being called a deadbeat by someone whose household I've been supporting for 8 years. Dad flinched at the word deadbeat, finally understanding that his private cruelty had become public knowledge. The comfortable fiction that his comments had been harmless was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable reality of their impact. What does that mean, practically? Mom asked. It was a fair question, and one I was still figuring out. But Marcus's confrontation had clarified something important. I couldn't keep functioning as the family's unpaid support system while being treated as its least valuable member. The contradiction was destroying my self-respect and enabling their casual cruelty. It means, I said slowly, working out the details as I spoke, that I'm going to start making decisions based on what's best for me, instead of what's most convenient for everyone else. The conversation ended without resolution, which felt appropriate. Years of established patterns don't shift in a single evening, no matter how dramatically they're exposed. Helen and Marcus left the next morning with awkward hugs and promises to talk soon. Dad retreated to his workshop in the basement. Mom cleaned the kitchen with unusual intensity, as if scrubbing dishes could restore family harmony. I went home to my apartment and sat at the kitchen table with Mr. Miller's paperwork spread in front of me. Partnership agreements, loan applications, business plans, all the documentation of a future I could choose if I had the courage to disappoint people who were already disappointed in me. Monday morning came with unusual clarity. I called in sick to Miller's, the first time I'd used a sick day for mental health rather than physical illness. Instead of going to work, I drove to the community college and picked up enrollment information for their business program. Night classes, designed for working adults, affordable even without family support. The woman in the admissions office was encouragingly practical. "You've got solid work experience," she said, reviewing my employment history. "That counts for a lot in business courses." Real-world application makes the theory more meaningful. Real-world application. The phrase stuck with me as I drove home. 8 years of real-world application, dismissed by Dad as just retail work, but recognized by admissions counselors as valuable preparation for business education. That evening, Dad called. "I've been thinking about yesterday," he said without preamble. "So have I replied, waiting to see which direction he'd take the conversation. "Maybe I've been too protective," he said carefully. "Too focused on the practical challenges instead of the possibilities." It wasn't an apology, but it was closer to acknowledgement than I'd expected. Maybe I agreed. "This business opportunity," he continued, "maybe you should look into it more seriously." The conditional support felt familiar, encouragement hedged with enough qualifications that he could withdraw it later if things didn't work out as he expected. But it was more than he'd offered before Marcus's confrontation. "I am looking into it," I told him. "I picked up college enrollment information today." Silence stretched across the phone line. "Finally," he said, "that's good. Education is important." The same man who dismissed business school as too expensive and too late was now endorsing education in general terms. The cognitive dissonance would have been funny if it hadn't been so painful. His opinion of my capabilities seemed to shift based on external validation rather than consistent assessment of my actual performance. Over the following weeks, the family dynamic felt fragile and strange. Helen called more often, her conversations peppered with questions about my plans and apologies for things she'd never noticed before. "I should have said something," became her repeated refrain. "I should have stood up for you." Mom's approach was more subtle: care packages of food, casual offers to help with application paperwork, small gestures of support that acknowledged my independence while trying to maintain connection. She'd never been good with direct confrontation, but she understood the language of practical assistance. Dad's adjustment was the most complicated. He'd oscillate between his old patterns of casual dismissal and new attempts at encouragement that felt forced and uncomfortable. The shift was too dramatic to be genuine, but it was consistent enough to suggest actual effort rather than temporary guilt. Marcus called one evening while Helen was at a faculty meeting. "How are you handling everything?" he asked. "Still figuring it out," I admitted. "It's weird having someone in the family actually defend me." "You shouldn't have needed defending," he said. "But I'm glad I could provide it." "Why did you?" I asked. "I mean, you could have stayed out of it. Kept the peace." He was quiet for a moment. "Because I recognize the pattern. Military families deal with similar dynamics, someone always sacrificing for the greater good, until the sacrificing becomes expected and the person becomes invisible." The comparison hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. The military understanding of service and sacrifice, but also of recognition and respect for that sacrifice. Dad respected Marcus's military service partly because it was officially acknowledged, formally recognized, publicly honored. My service to the family had been invisible, informal, unacknowledged. Besides, Marcus continued, Helen loves you, and watching her family treat you that way was hard for her, even when she didn't know how to address it. That conversation shifted something in my relationship with Helen. The next time she called, I was more honest about the years of accumulated hurt. She cried, which surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness or minimization, not genuine grief for what I'd experienced while she'd been building her own life. I was so focused on my own path, she said. I never looked back to see what it was costing you. I didn't want you to, I admitted. I thought that was what love looked like, making sure you succeeded, even if it meant I didn't. That's not love, she said firmly. That's martyrdom. And it's not fair to either of us. The distinction was important. Love should involve mutual support and shared sacrifice, not one person constantly giving while others constantly receive. The pattern I'd established had been unhealthy for everyone. It had made me resentful, Helen guilty, and Dad comfortable with exploitation he might not have accepted if it had been more visible. 3 weeks after Marcus's confrontation, I submitted my partnership paperwork to Mr. Miller and my enrollment application to the college. Both felt like acts of rebellion and self-respect combined. I was finally making decisions based on my own goals rather than other people's needs. The night I mailed the applications, I called Helen. I did it, I told her. Business school and the partnership opportunity. I'm proud of you, she said, and for the first time in years, family pride felt genuine rather than conditional. Dad's response was more complicated. When I told him about the applications, he nodded thoughtfully. Well, he said finally, I suppose we'll see how it works out. Still hedging. Still protecting himself from having to fully commit to supporting my success. But it was progress, and progress felt like enough for now. Spring brought acceptance letters and loan approvals, partnership contracts, and class schedules. The community college business program started in June, designed to accommodate working adults who couldn't abandon their current income while building their future. 3 nights a week, 2 hours per session, practical coursework that built on real experience rather than replacing it. The partnership with Mr. Miller became official in May. I kept my full-time schedule while taking on additional responsibilities, expanded inventory management, customer relationship development, financial planning for potential franchise locations. The learning curve was steep, but it felt different from previous challenges. This time, I was building something for myself instead of maintaining something for others. Dad's adjustment to my new status was awkward and inconsistent. He'd oscillate between his old dismissive patterns and new attempts at supportive interest that felt forced and uncomfortable. When neighbors asked about my business venture, he'd respond with cautious pride hedged with practical concerns. She's trying something new, he'd say, but we'll see how it works out. The conditional support felt familiar, but less devastating now. I'd stopped requiring his approval for my decisions, which made his withheld enthusiasm less powerful. His opinions still mattered, but it no longer determined my self-worth or my choices. Helen's support was more consistent and genuine. She'd call to ask about coursework, celebrate small victories, offer encouragement during stressful weeks. The sister relationship I'd always wanted was emerging now that we'd acknowledged the inequality that had distorted it for years. I wish I'd understood sooner, she said during one of our conversations. I wish I'd pushed back when Dad dismissed your contributions. You were building your own life, I replied. That's what you were supposed to be doing. But not at your expense, she said. There should have been room for both of us to succeed. The insight was important. Success didn't have to be a zero-sum game within families. Supporting one person's dreams shouldn't require sacrificing another person's opportunities. The either-or mentality that had governed our family's resource allocation had been a choice, not a necessity. Marcus visited in July, alone this time while Helen attended a teaching conference. He stopped by Miller's to see the operation, asking intelligent questions about inventory systems, customer demographics, profit margins. His military background gave him an appreciation for logistics and planning that translated well to retail operations. "This is impressive," he said, reviewing our quarterly reports. "You're not just managing a store, you're running a business." The distinction mattered. Managing implied maintenance, following established procedures, keeping things stable. Running implied leadership, strategic thinking, growth planning. Dad had always described my role in management terms, but Marcus's assessment recognized the leadership aspects that Dad had consistently overlooked. Over dinner that evening, Marcus updated me on his own career progression. He'd been offered advanced leadership training that could lead to commissioned officer status. "Helen's excited about it," he said, "but nervous about the additional responsibilities." "Are you nervous?" I asked. He considered the question seriously. "Not about the work itself. I've been preparing for this level of responsibility for years. But about the recognition that comes with it. Sometimes getting promoted means people start expecting you to be different than you actually are." The observation resonated. Recognition often came with expectations that had little to do with actual capabilities or character. Dad's respect for Marcus was partly based on his military status, but that respect could become a burden if it required Marcus to be someone other than himself. "Your dad asked me to talk to you," Marcus said suddenly. I set down my fork, immediately wary. "About what?" "About slowing down. About not taking on too much too fast." Marcus's tone was carefully neutral. "He's worried you're overextending yourself." The familiar pattern was reasserting itself. Dad couldn't directly discourage my goals anymore without seeming unsupportive, so he was outsourcing his concerns to someone whose opinion I valued. Using Marcus's credibility to undermine my confidence in ways his own words could no longer accomplish. "What did you tell him?" I asked. Marcus smiled grimly. "I told him that military leadership training teaches you to recognize people who can handle increased responsibility and that you've been demonstrating those capabilities for years." I also told him that his concerns seemed more about his comfort level than your actual limitations. The directness of his response surprised me. Marcus wasn't just refusing to carry Dad's message, he was actively countering it with his own assessment. The loyalty he'd shown during the family dinner was apparently ongoing rather than momentary. "He didn't like that answer," Marcus continued. "Asked me to reconsider, to think about the practical challenges you might face." And I told him the only practical challenge I could see was lack of family support, and that seemed easily remedied if he chose to remedy it. The conversation represented a fundamental shift in family dynamics. Marcus wasn't just defending me, he was refusing to enable Dad's undermining behavior. The triangulation that Dad had used for years to manage family relationships was being disrupted by someone who understood manipulation tactics and refused to participate in them. When Marcus left the next morning, he hugged me goodbye with military formality. "Your success isn't a threat to anyone else's," he said quietly. "Remember that when people try to convince you otherwise." The words stayed with me through the challenging weeks that followed. Business school coursework was demanding, requiring analytical thinking I hadn't used since high school. Partnership responsibilities meant longer hours and higher stakes decisions. Some nights I'd fall into bed exhausted, wondering if Dad's concerns about overextension might be valid. But progress was visible in ways that made the exhaustion worthwhile. Customer satisfaction scores improved as I implemented better inventory management. Profit margins increased as I negotiated more favorable supplier contracts. The college coursework provided theoretical frameworks for strategies I'd been developing instinctively through experience. Most importantly, I was building something that belonged to me. For the first time in my adult life, my daily efforts were creating value that I would receive directly rather than contributing to goals that others would achieve. The psychological shift was as significant as the practical changes. Dad's response to my visible progress was complicated. He couldn't dismiss achievements that were documented in profit reports and grade transcripts, but he seemed uncomfortable with success he couldn't take credit for or control. His congratulations felt grudging, his encouragement felt forced, his pride felt conditional. "I hope you're not neglecting other aspects of your life," he said when I mentioned making Dean's List for my first semester. The comment was classic Dad, a criticism disguised as concern, a way of diminishing an achievement by focusing on its potential costs rather than its actual value. But Marcus's words had given me a framework for understanding these tactics, which made them less effective. "I'm building a life that works for me," I replied. "All aspects of it." The boundary was subtle but firm. I wasn't rejecting his concern, but I wasn't accepting his implied criticism either. My life choices were mine to make and mine to evaluate, regardless of his comfort level with my decisions. Fall brought expanded responsibilities and new challenges. Mr. Miller had identified potential franchise locations, and I was involved in the feasibility studies and market analysis. The work required skills I was still developing, but it also provided practical applications for my coursework that made both more meaningful. During one particularly stressful week, when I was managing a difficult supplier negotiation while preparing for midterm exams, Helen called with unexpected news. "Dad asked me to talk to you," she said, echoing Marcus's words from months earlier. My heart sank. "What about this time?" "About considering moving back home. To save money while you're in school and getting the business established." The suggestion was superficially practical but fundamentally manipulative. Moving back home would reduce my expenses, but increase Dad's control over my daily decisions. It would make me financially dependent again, just as I was achieving financial independence. Most importantly, it would reinforce the family dynamic where my autonomy was negotiable and my independence was temporary. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that you're an adult who's been supporting herself successfully for years, and that his suggestion sounded more like a way to regain control than a way to provide support." Helen's response surprised me. 6 months earlier, she might have endorsed Dad's suggestion as practically sound while missing its emotional implications. But Marcus's confrontation seemed to have sharpened her awareness of family manipulation tactics. "He didn't appreciate that perspective," she continued. "Asked me to think about your long-term financial stability." "My financial stability is improving because I'm building assets instead of just paying expenses," I replied. "Moving backward doesn't serve my long-term interests, even if it might reduce short-term costs." The conversation represented another shift in family dynamics. Dad could no longer count on Helen to reinforce his perspective or carry his messages without question. The united front he'd always been able to maintain was fracturing as family members developed independent assessments of situations. That weekend, Dad called directly. "Helen says you're not interested in moving back home." "That's right," I replied without elaboration. "I was just trying to be helpful," he said, his tone suggesting injured innocence. "I understand," I said, "but I don't need that kind of help right now." The boundary was clear and non-negotiable. I wasn't attacking his motives or explaining my reasoning in detail. I was simply declining his offer and moving forward with my own plans. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose you know what's best for yourself." The grudging acknowledgement felt like progress, even though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it. For the first time in years, he was accepting my autonomy without a prolonged argument or guilt campaign. Winter arrived with final exams and year-end business planning. The partnership was exceeding performance projections, and my academic work was providing frameworks for expansion strategies we hadn't previously considered. The convergence of education and experience was creating opportunities neither could have generated alone. Christmas approached with the usual family gathering expectations, but this year felt different. I had achievements to celebrate that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. I had goals that were mine to pursue rather than sacrifices to make for others. Most importantly, I had established boundaries that had been tested and held firm. The prospect of family dinner no longer felt like a trial to endure. It felt like an opportunity to demonstrate growth, to model healthy relationships, and to enjoy the family connections that had always existed beneath the dysfunctional patterns. Marcus's confrontation had cleared the air in ways that made genuine relationship possible. As I wrapped presents and planned dishes to contribute, I realized that my relationship with Dad would probably never be perfect. His patterns of control and dismissal were too deeply ingrained to disappear completely. But they no longer had the power to derail my life or undermine my self-worth. I'd built something strong enough to withstand his disapproval and substantial enough to earn his grudging respect. Christmas Eve dinner felt like a diplomatic summit, Everyone carefully polite, nobody quite sure what topics were safe for discussion. Helen and Marcus arrived with gifts and cautious optimism. Mom had prepared enough food for twice our number, her usual response to family tension. Dad presided over the table with subdued authority, his comfort disrupted by the new family dynamics, but his basic personality unchanged. The conversation stayed safely superficial for the first hour. Weather, neighborhood news, Helen's teaching stories, Marcus's latest training exercises. We were all performing normalcy, testing whether we could function as a family without the dramatic confrontations that had characterized recent gatherings. Finally, Marcus broke the careful détente. "How's business school going?" he asked, directing the question to me but speaking loudly enough that everyone would hear the answer. I updated them on my coursework, the partnership expansion, the franchise planning. Concrete achievements with measurable outcomes, progress that couldn't be dismissed as wishful thinking or diminished through faint praise. Dad listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral. "That's impressive," Mom said when I finished. "You're really building something substantial." The acknowledgement felt genuine rather than obligatory. Mom had always been more supportive than Dad, but her support had often felt helpless in the face of his disapproval. Now she seemed willing to express her opinions independently of his reactions. "The franchise model is smart," Marcus added. "Proven systems, established customer base, reduced risk compared to starting from scratch." Dad nodded thoughtfully. "Assuming the market analysis supports expansion," he said, finally joining the conversation. It wasn't enthusiastic endorsement, but it wasn't dismissive criticism either. He was engaging with my plans as legitimate business ventures rather than unrealistic fantasies. The shift felt significant, even if it came with typical Dad qualifications and concerns. "Market analysis shows strong demand in 3 potential locations," I replied, treating his comment as genuine business discussion rather than veiled discouragement. "Demographics support the customer base, and competition analysis suggests room for another quality supplier." Dad's eyebrows rose slightly. Market analysis and demographic studies weren't retail clerk activities, they were business owner responsibilities. The language I was using, the concepts I was discussing, the strategic thinking I was demonstrating all contradicted his assessment of my capabilities. "When do you expect to make expansion decisions?" he asked. The question was purely practical, focused on timeline and process rather than whether expansion was advisable. He was treating me as someone capable of making sophisticated business decisions, someone whose plans deserved serious consideration rather than protective discouragement. "Next spring," I replied. "After I complete the financial planning coursework and we finish the current location's performance analysis." Helen smiled across the table. "It sounds like you're really hitting your stride." The phrase captured something important. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving toward goals I'd chosen rather than adapting to circumstances others had created. The momentum was internal and self-directed rather than external and reactive. "She always was smart," Dad said suddenly, his voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard before. "Just took her a while to find the right direction." The comment was vintage Dad, a compliment undermined by implications about my previous choices. But it was also more positive than anything he'd said about my abilities in years. The grudging acknowledgement felt like progress, even if it came with typical qualifications. "Direction was never the problem," Marcus said quietly. "Opportunity was the problem." The distinction was crucial. Dad's comment implied that I'd been wandering aimlessly until recently, finally stumbling onto a viable path through luck or maturation. Marcus's correction suggested that I'd always had clear goals, but had been prevented from pursuing them by family circumstances and expectations. Dad's mouth tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. Marcus's military authority still carried weight, and his assessments were harder to dismiss than mine would have been. The external validation was changing Dad's perspective in ways that my own arguments never could have accomplished. After dinner, Helen helped me clear the table while Marcus and Dad discussed current events in the living room. The kitchen conversation felt easier than it had in years, less loaded with unspoken tensions and accumulated resentments. "You seem different," Helen observed, scraping plates with unnecessary intensity. More confident, I guess. I feel different, I admitted. Like I'm finally living my own life instead of managing everyone else's. Is that how it felt before? Like you were managing our lives? The question was genuine, not defensive. Helen was trying to understand dynamics she'd been too young or too focused elsewhere to recognize at the time. Her awareness felt important, not just for our relationship, but for her own understanding of family patterns she might unconsciously replicate. Not managing, I said carefully. More like absorbing the costs of your successes. Making sure the family stayed financially stable while you and Dad pursued your goals. She was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. That's not fair, she said finally. No, it wasn't. But it felt necessary at the time. Like the family would fall apart if someone didn't sacrifice their goals for everyone else's stability. Someone, or specifically you? The question cut to the heart of the issue. The sacrifices hadn't been randomly distributed or collectively shared. They'd been systematically assigned to the family member least likely to protest effectively, the younger daughter, the one without clear external validation, the one whose dreams were easiest to dismiss as impractical. Specifically me, I acknowledged. Because my goals were considered less important than other people's needs. Helen's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. I never wanted that. If I'd understood the cost, you couldn't have understood, I interrupted gently. You were 18, focused on college and your future. You were supposed to be thinking about your own goals. But not exclusively. Not at your expense. The conversation continued as we finished cleaning, both of us working through years of unexamined assumptions and unconscious guilt. Helen's tears weren't self-indulgent, they were recognition of impact she'd never intended, but had nevertheless benefited from. When we rejoined the men in the living room, the atmosphere had shifted again. Dad and Marcus were deep in conversation about leadership principles, military structure, business management techniques. For once, Dad seemed genuinely interested in learning rather than just holding forth on topics he considered himself expert in. Marcus was telling me about some of the strategic planning they do in the military, Dad said when we sat down. Sounds similar to what you're doing with the franchise analysis. The comparison was remarkable for several reasons. Dad was acknowledging similarities between my business planning and Marcus's military responsibilities, implicitly elevating my work to a level he respected. He was also deferring to Marcus's expertise on strategic planning, admitting gaps in his own knowledge that my education was helping to fill. Strategic planning principles are pretty universal, I replied. Military, business, personal, the basic framework is similar. Marcus nodded approvingly. Risk assessment, resource allocation, timeline development, contingency planning. Whether you're planning a deployment or a business expansion, the process is fundamentally the same. Dad looked thoughtful. I suppose I never considered the similarities before. The admission was significant. Dad had always dismissed business education as theoretical rather than practical, academic rather than applicable. But Marcus's military perspective was giving him a framework for understanding strategic thinking that he could respect and value. As the evening wound down, Dad pulled me aside while Helen and Marcus were getting their coats. I want you to know, he said awkwardly, that I'm proud of what you're accomplishing. The words felt genuine, though they came with visible effort. Admitting pride in achievements he'd previously dismissed required him to acknowledge errors in judgment he'd been reluctant to examine. Thank you, I replied simply, not making it easier for him by minimizing the significance of his acknowledgement. I may not have expressed that support as clearly as I should have, he continued, struggling with something approaching an apology. No, you didn't, I agreed, maintaining the honesty that Marcus's confrontation had established as acceptable in our family conversations. Dad nodded, accepting the truth of my statement without defensive protests. Well, I'm trying to do better. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was recognition of past failures and commitment to future improvement. For Dad, it represented substantial emotional growth and personal accountability. I appreciate that, I told him, and meant it. The evening ended with genuine hugs rather than obligatory ones, tentative connection rather than performed family harmony. Progress felt fragile but real, built on acknowledged truth rather than comfortable fiction. Driving home, I reflected on the changes that had occurred since Marcus's confrontation 11 months earlier. External circumstances had shifted dramatically: business school, partnership opportunities, financial independence, family recognition. But the internal changes felt even more significant. I no longer required Dad's approval to validate my choices or his pride to confirm my worth. His opinions mattered because I loved him, but they no longer determined my self-concept or my life direction. The desperate need for family validation that had driven years of self-sacrifice had been replaced by solid self-knowledge and independent achievement. Most importantly, I'd learned to distinguish between love and exploitation, between family loyalty and personal martyrdom, between supporting others and sacrificing myself. The boundaries I'd established weren't walls, they were foundations for healthier relationships built on mutual respect rather than unequal sacrifice. 5 years later, I stood in the conference room of Weber Hardware's third location, reviewing quarterly reports with Mr. Miller and our management team. The franchise had exceeded all projections, expanding into neighboring counties with consistent profitability and strong customer satisfaction scores. My business degree had led to an MBA program, completed part-time while managing daily operations and strategic planning. The transformation was measurable in ways that even Dad couldn't dismiss. Revenue growth, market share expansion, employee retention rates, community recognition awards. Success documented in numbers, achievements verified by external validation, progress that spoke for itself without requiring explanation or justification. Helen called that afternoon while I was reviewing site plans for a potential fourth location. "Dad wants to know if you'll be home for Easter dinner," she said, but her tone suggested the question carried additional significance. "Is there a particular reason he's asking through you instead of calling directly?" I replied. Helen laughed. "Because he wants to invite someone to meet you, and he's nervous about your reaction." The mystery guest turned out to be his new financial advisor, a woman Dad had hired to help manage his retirement planning. "She's impressed by what you've built," Helen explained. "Apparently Dad's been bragging about your business success, and she wants to discuss some investment opportunities with you." The reversal was almost comical. Dad, who had dismissed my business acumen for years, was now using my achievements to impress his professional contacts. The daughter he'd called a deadbeat had become his success story, the family member whose accomplishments reflected well on his parenting and judgment. Easter dinner felt like a celebration rather than an endurance test. Dad introduced me to his financial advisor with obvious pride, detailing my educational achievements and business expansion with the same enthusiasm he'd once reserved for Marcus's military career. The woman was genuinely interested in my strategic planning process, asking intelligent questions about market analysis and growth projections. "Your father says you've built this from a single retail position," she said during dessert. "That's impressive business development." "She always had the capability," Dad replied. "Just needed the right opportunity to demonstrate it." The revision of history was breathtaking. Dad was claiming credit for recognizing potential he'd actively discouraged, rewriting years of dismissive comments as protective concern about market timing rather than fundamental doubts about my abilities. But the revisionism felt less important than the current reality, genuine pride in achievements he could no longer minimize or ignore. Marcus and Helen had driven down from his new base in Virginia, where he'd recently been promoted to captain. The military authority that had given weight to his original defense of me remained intact, but the family dynamics no longer required his intervention. Dad treated me with consistent respect now, not because Marcus was watching, but because my achievements had forced him to recalibrate his assessment of my capabilities. After dinner, Marcus and I walked around the neighborhood where I'd grown up, past the high school where I'd first started working to support family expenses, past the community college where I'd completed my business degree, past the bank where I now had business loans and investment accounts in my own name. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't spoken up that night?" Marcus asked. I considered the question seriously. "I think eventually something would have forced the issue," I said. "Maybe not as dramatically, but the situation wasn't sustainable long term." "What makes you say that?" because I was starting to resent the people I loved most. That kind of accumulated anger eventually demands resolution, one way or another. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Military families deal with similar dynamics sometimes. One person carrying burdens that should be shared, until the carrying becomes expected instead of appreciated. The difference is that military sacrifice gets recognized, I replied. There are ceremonies, medals, official acknowledgement that the service matters. Family sacrifice often stays invisible until someone forces it into the light. That's why I had to say something, Marcus said. Because I could see the pattern, and I knew it would destroy your relationship with your father if it continued. The insight was probably accurate. Years more of casual dismissal and unacknowledged sacrifice would have built resentments too deep for later repair. Marcus's confrontation had forced a crisis that enabled change rather than allowing gradual deterioration that might have become irreversible. Do you think he's really changed? I asked. Or is he just responding to external pressure and visible success? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Probably some of both, he said finally. But change is change, regardless of what motivates it initially. The important thing is that the pattern of disrespect has stopped. We walked in comfortable silence for a few blocks, both lost in our own thoughts. The neighborhood looked smaller than it had when I was growing up, but not diminished, just properly proportioned to my adult perspective. I used to think family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment they offered, I said as we turned back toward the house. That pushing back or setting boundaries was selfish. And now? Now I think real loyalty requires honesty about harmful patterns. Accepting mistreatment doesn't protect the family, it enables dysfunction that hurts everyone eventually. Marcus smiled. That's a very military perspective, actually. Unit cohesion requires addressing problems directly rather than hoping they'll resolve themselves. The comparison felt appropriate. Healthy families, like effective military units, needed clear communication, mutual respect, and shared responsibility for collective success. The dysfunction I'd endured for years had served no one's long-term interests, even though it had felt like sacrifice at the time. As we approached the house, I could see Dad and his financial advisor still deep in conversation about investment strategies and market trends. Helen was helping Mom with dishes, their easy conversation audible through the open kitchen window. The scene looked like family harmony, but it felt different now, built on genuine respect rather than enforced compliance. That night, driving home to my own house in my own car to review my own business plans, I reflected on the journey from family doormat to independent success. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear. There had been moments of doubt, periods of financial stress, nights when Dad's old criticisms echoed in my head and made me question my capabilities. But Marcus's confrontation had given me permission to value myself as much as I'd always valued others. His defense had shown me what advocacy looked like, what respect sounded like, what family support could be when it was genuine rather than conditional. Most importantly, his intervention had forced a crisis that enabled change rather than allowing gradual erosion that might have become permanent. The deadbeat Dad had seen was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned to distinguish between love and exploitation, between family loyalty and personal sacrifice, between supporting others and destroying herself. The change wasn't just professional or financial, it was fundamental, affecting how I approached relationships, decisions, and self-assessment. 5 years of building something that belonged to me had taught me that success wasn't a limited resource that had to be rationed among family members. Helen's achievements and my achievements could coexist and complement each other rather than competing for finite family approval. Dad's respect could be earned through demonstrated competence rather than begged for through unlimited sacrifice. Most importantly, I'd learned that self-worth wasn't granted by family approval or demonstrated through family service. It was built through personal achievement, maintained through healthy boundaries, and protected through the courage to demand the respect I'd always deserved but never insisted upon. The woman Dad had called a deadbeat was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood the difference between family love and family exploitation, between supporting others and sacrificing herself, between being valued and being used. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and entirely worth the struggle it had required. So that's how the word deadbeat turned into the turning point of my life. I stopped living for my family's approval and started building a future of my own. Have you ever had someone in your family dismiss your hard work or take your sacrifices for granted? How did you handle it? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if you found this relatable, hit that like button, subscribe for more true stories, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth.